In 1842, at an estate outside Louisville, Kentucky, a young man named Stephen Bishop sat down to draw a world that almost no one else could see. He had no formal schooling that historians can document, no modern survey instruments, no electric light, no aerial image, and no printed chart to copy. According to the historical account maintained by Mammoth Cave National Park, he drew the explored passages of Mammoth Cave from memory. The surviving map looks at first like a web of veins. Passages branch, narrow, double back, and disappear toward the edges. Underground rivers are shaded. Chambers carry names drawn from classical mythology, geography, and the theatrical language of 19th-century tourism. At the bottom, in unusually prominent type, the map identifies its maker, Stephen Bishop, one of the guides. That credit matters because Bishop was enslaved. It is tempting to describe him as uneducated. That would be wrong. Franklin Gorin, the cave owner who had once enslaved him, later called Bishop self-educated and praised his knowledge of geology, his memory, and even his familiarity with Latin and Greek. The real claim is not that Bishop had no education. It is that a society denying him ordinary access to formal education could not prevent him from learning. He was not free to choose his employer, leave the property, negotiate the value of his knowledge, or claim the cave discoveries in the way a white explorer might have done. Yet visitors, scientists, and owners depended on him to move through a landscape where ordinary authority became almost useless. Underground, status could not show a traveler which corridor returned to daylight. Memory could. The familiar version of this story calls Bishop the man who drew Mammoth Cave's first map. The evidence requires more careful language. The National Park Service describes his work as one of the first detailed maps of the cave. Not necessarily the first map of any kind. That correction does not reduce the achievement. It makes the real mystery sharper. How did an enslaved teenager become the leading interpreter of a cave that would later be recognized as the longest known cave system on Earth? How much of the map came from his own exploration? And why did the document preserve his name when so much of his life remained recorded by other people? To answer those questions, we have to begin before Stephen Bishop entered the cave, because Mammoth Cave already held a human history thousands of years old. A cave that was never empty. The word discovery can hide as much as it reveals. Long before commercial guides carried paying visitors into Mammoth Cave, prehistoric indigenous people entered its upper levels with river cane torches. Archaeological evidence preserved in the dry passages shows that people explored the cave between roughly 5,000 and 4,000 years ago. They collected minerals including gypsum and left behind torch remains, woven sandals, gourd containers, footprints, and images on the cave walls. The National Park Service estimates that these early explorers reached more than 19 miles of passage within the modern park. That distance is important. It means the cave was not an untouched wilderness waiting for 19th-century entrepreneurs. It was a cultural landscape entered, understood, and used by people whose names are no longer known to us. The park today consults with 7 federally recognized nations traditionally affiliated with the area, 3 Cherokee nations, 3 Shawnee nations, and the Chickasaw Nation. That consultation reflects an essential distinction. One, archaeologists can describe artifacts and dates, but material evidence does not give modern researchers permission to invent the beliefs of the people who carried those torches. The purpose of the minerals remains uncertain. Medicine, agriculture, trade, and ritual have all been proposed, but the evidence does not settle the question. By the late 18th and early 19th centuries, a different economy entered the cave. Enslaved African Americans labored in saltpeter production, processing the nitrate-rich cave earth used in gunpowder. During the War of 1812, the material was strategically valuable. The people who extracted it worked in smoke, darkness, and cold to support a nation whose liberty did not include them. When the saltpeter business declined, Mammoth Cave was repackaged as an attraction. Hotel workers prepared rooms and meals. Guides led visitors into the passages. The cave's commercial identity changed, but coercive labor remained central. This is the world Stephen Bishop entered in 1838. He did not arrive as an independent adventurer. He arrived as property. The teenager brought to the cave. Stephen Bishop was probably about 17 when Franklin Gorin brought him to Mammoth Cave. Even the basic facts of Bishop's early life are incomplete. The record becomes clearer only when his labor became useful to people who kept documents. Gorin had acquired the cave property as a tourist enterprise. He placed Bishop there as a guide, a role that required much more than memorizing a safe route. A guide had to manage flame, distance, fatigue, fear, and the unpredictable behavior of visitors. He had to recognize landmarks that could look entirely different when approached from the opposite direction. He had to know where passages narrowed, where drops opened in the floor, and how long a group could travel before turning back. In 1839, physician John Croghan purchased the cave estate. Bishop and other enslaved people were included in the transfer. The language is uncomfortable because the reality was worse: ownership of a place and ownership of human beings passed through the same transaction. Croghan continued the tourism business and later attempted to use part of the cave as a treatment site for tuberculosis. Patients lived in stone and wooden structures underground, where the stable temperature was supposed to help them. The experiment failed. Smoke, dampness, isolation, and inadequate medical understanding offered no cure. Several patients died, and Croghan himself later died of tuberculosis. While owners tested theories and visitors sought spectacle, Bishop learned the cave in the most demanding way possible, by repeatedly entering it. His education was practical, but it was not narrow. Later accounts praised his knowledge of geology and his ability to absorb information from educated guests. Franklin Gorin remembered him as exceptionally intelligent, observant, humorous, and reliable. Those descriptions must be read critically. Most surviving portraits of Bishop were written by white visitors or former owners, people who admired him while participating in or benefiting from the society that denied him freedom. Their praise does not erase that contradiction. But the consistency of the testimony matters. Again and again, visitors described a guide whose command of the cave exceeded theirs, whose memory astonished them, and whose personality became nearly as famous as the attraction itself. The cave gave Bishop no freedom in the legal sense. Yet underground, knowledge altered the balance between guide and guest. The person with the money might own the ticket. The person with the map in his mind controlled the return to daylight. Two beyond the bottomless pit. One obstacle divided the familiar tourist cave from the passages beyond it, a deep opening known as the bottomless pit. The name was theatrical, but the danger was real enough. Early visitors reached its edge and stopped. Beyond it lay a region that could not become part of the cave's known geography until someone found a way across. Bishop is credited with helping make that crossing and with opening extensive new areas to exploration. The exact details vary in later retellings. Some versions transform the event into a dramatic balancing act on a cedar pole. More cautious accounts describe a ladder or ladders laid across the opening. The distinction is a useful warning. A powerful historical story attracts decoration. Repetition can turn a plausible event into a legend without anyone deliberately deciding to lie. What is not seriously disputed is the result. After the barrier was crossed, exploration expanded. Bishop became associated with major discoveries and with names still used in the cave. The Mammoth Dome and the ruins of Karnak are among the features credited to him. Elsewhere, names such as the River Styx and Lake Lethe reveal the classical vocabulary that shaped the cave's 19th-century identity. Naming was not a trivial act. A named chamber could be remembered, advertised, and connected to a route. Names converted darkness into geography. They also converted geography into commerce. Bishop was performing several roles at once. He was a guide responsible for visitors. He was an explorer moving beyond established routes. He was a natural history interpreter learning geological terms from scientists and returning observations of his own. And he was, in effect, a living navigation system in an environment where a wrong turn could waste hours or extinguish the confidence of an entire group. His growing reputation created another contradiction. The more famous he became, the more valuable his labor was to the business that controlled him. Visitors requested him by name. Writers described him in travel accounts. Yet, public recognition did not equal personal independence. This tension is central to understanding the map. Bishop did not produce it after retiring from a celebrated scientific career. He produced it while enslaved, inside a system that could praise his genius and still deny his ownership of himself. The achievement was not merely remembering a sequence of rooms. A cave is not a road. It is a three-dimensional network that branches above and below itself, repeats visual patterns, and offers few external reference points. To map it, Bishop had to transform movement through darkness into a stable mental structure. The guide who carried the cave in his head. Modern cave surveyors measure distance, direction, slope, and elevation station by station. Their notes can be checked, recalculated, and tied into a larger coordinate system. Bishop's map was not produced by that method. It is better understood as a topological map, a representation of how places connect, even when exact scale and orientation are imperfect. That difference explains both its limitations and its brilliance. Imagine walking through miles of irregular passage by weak flame. Some corridors are broad enough to resemble underground avenues. Others force the body sideways. Rivers interrupt routes. Pits divide levels. A chamber entered from the north may be nearly unrecognizable when approached later from the east. There is no sun to establish direction and no distant skyline to restore perspective. Bishop had to remember junction order, relative length, prominent formations, water, and the changing dimensions of passages. He also had to separate routes experienced on different days and combine them into one coherent network. A mistaken connection on paper could misrepresent an entire branch. The park's account says that in 1842, while visiting Locust Grove, the Croghan family estate in Louisville, Bishop drew the explored passages from memory. The phrase "from memory" has become the most celebrated part of the three-story, but it should not be treated as magic. His memory was trained through repetition. Guiding was a daily discipline in spatial recall. The map was extraordinary because he converted that embodied knowledge into a document other people could use. The lines do not behave like a modern engineering plan. Distances stretch and compress. Orientation is not consistently reliable. Yet junctions, route relationships, and the broad organization of the cave are remarkably intelligible. Water areas are distinguished. Passage names guide the reader through the same narrative landscape. Visitors heard underground. This was not a map of the cave as it is now known. It was a map of the explored cave in Bishop's time. The distinction matters because Mammoth Cave is vastly larger than any one 19th-century guide could have known. The modern system has been extended through generations of surveys and major cave connections. Still, Bishop's drawing became a foundation. It translated a body of knowledge held by an enslaved guide into a portable record. That record could outlast a tour, a visitor's memory, and eventually Bishop himself. If careful, evidence-based history is the kind of documentary work you value, subscribe after this section. The next part is where the map's printed credit becomes as revealing as the passages it contains. The name printed beneath the lines. The map was published with a guidebook titled Rambles in the Mammoth Cave, during the year 1844, by a visitor. Surviving copies and catalog records are not always described with identical dates, but the map belongs securely to the mid-1840s publication History of the Cave. Its title identifies the explored parts of Mammoth Cave in Kentucky. Beneath that title appears Bishop's name and the description that he was one of the guides. For an enslaved black man in the antebellum United States to receive visible cartographic credit was highly unusual. But unusual credit should not be confused with equality. We do not have evidence that Bishop controlled the publication, owned the plate, received royalties, or possessed the legal authority to decide how the map would be sold. His name appeared because his expertise was undeniable and commercially useful. The printed acknowledgement preserved authorship while the surrounding institution continued to profit from unfree labor. That is why the map can be read in two ways at once. It is evidence of recognition. It is also evidence of exploitation. The guidebook turned Bishop's mental geography into an object visitors could carry away. It made the cave appear knowable before a tourist entered. It also strengthened the cave's reputation as a place of scale, danger, and cultivated wonder. A map does not merely describe an attraction, it authenticates it. Bishop's own presence did the same. Contemporary visitors wrote about his intelligence, memory, appearance, humor, and command of geological vocabulary. One observer said he could remember people who had visited and recall scientific terms he heard from educated guests. Another described him as nearly as well known as the cave. These accounts reveal how knowledge circulated underground. Professors and travelers brought formal terminology. Bishop absorbed it, tested it against the physical cave, and used it in later tours. He was not simply repeating a memorized speech. He was participating in a continuing exchange between lived observation and 19th century science. At the same time, every description passed through the prejudices of its writer. Some visitors exoticized him. Others treated his intelligence as surprising because racism had taught them not to expect it. The documentary record therefore tells us about Bishop and about the people looking at him. The map escapes some of that framing. Its lines do not ask whether the cartographer should have been capable of drawing them. They simply demonstrate that he was. For what the map proves, and what it does not. A responsible documentary must resist the temptation to make Bishop superhuman. Calling the map perfect would weaken the story because it would replace a real accomplishment with a legend. The document was not a precise instrumental survey. Its scale varies. Some directions and lengths are approximate. Later cartographers equipped with surveying tools produced more accurate measurements. In 1908, German mining engineer Max Camper, working with guide Ed Bishop, conducted a major instrumental survey of Mammoth Cave. That later map belongs to a different technical category. Stephen Bishop's map solved a different problem. It organized a complex underground network well enough to preserve relationships among passages and to communicate the explored geography of the 1840s. Its importance lies less in exact coordinates than in connected structure. This is also where the phrase "first map" becomes risky. The cave had been worked, toured, and described before 1842. Sketches or partial representations may have existed. The strongest official wording is that Bishop made one of the first detailed maps. That is the claim the evidence comfortably supports. Another popular claim says that Bishop's map anticipated the famous 1972 connection between Mammoth Cave and the Flint Ridge system by showing a passage lead near the eventual connection route. This interpretation appears in later histories of cave exploration. It is plausible and fascinating, but it should be stated carefully. Bishop did not label a future connection to the world's longest cave system, and he could not have known what 20th century cavers would prove. At most, the line suggests that he recorded a continuation whose full significance emerged much later. The 1972 connection itself is firmly documented. Explorers entered from the Flint Ridge side and reached a tourist trail in Mammoth Cave, joining two previously mapped systems into a cave more than 144 miles long at the time. Continued exploration has extended the known system far beyond that figure. Bishop's contribution belongs near the beginning of that long chain, not outside it. He was not the single discoverer of Mammoth Cave, and the cave's history should not be reduced to one heroic man. Indigenous explorers, enslaved miners, black guides, local families, scientists, surveyors, and organized caving groups all added knowledge. Yet collective history can still contain individual brilliance. Bishop's map is one of the clearest surviving examples. Freedom delayed. John Croghan died in 1849. His will provided for the people he enslaved to be freed after a delay. Bishop remained at Mammoth Cave through the years that followed, continuing to guide and build the reputation attached to his name. Freedom came in 1856, near the end of his life. The National Park Service records that Bishop, his wife Charlotte, and their son Thomas moved to a 75-acre tract near the cave. For a man whose expertise had helped make Mammoth Cave famous, the timing is painfully narrow. He had spent nearly 2 decades guiding visitors through an underground world, much of that time without legal control over his own movement. He lived as a free man for only a short period before dying in 1857 from causes that remain uncertain. Bishop was buried near the cave in the cemetery now called the Old Guide Cemetery. The site also contains graves connected to Croghan's failed tuberculosis experiment. It is a small landscape where several parts of the cave's 19th century story meet: tourism, medicine, slavery, labor, death, and memory. The grave is not the only memorial. The more enduring monument is the geography itself. Visitors still move through places Bishop helped explore and name. Rangers tell his story. His map continues to circulate in books, exhibits, and digital archives. But commemoration creates its own danger. Once a person becomes a symbol, the rough edges of the life can be polished away. Bishop is sometimes presented as proof that talent naturally rises above oppression. That interpretation is comforting and wrong. His talent did not defeat slavery. Slavery constrained where he lived, who benefited from his labor, and how much of his own testimony survived. What the evidence shows is not that injustice became harmless in the presence of genius. It shows how much knowledge can be produced by a person even while an unjust system limits his choices and captures much of the value. Charlotte and Thomas also remind us that Bishop's life did not end at the boundary of public fame. He was a husband and father. The decisions associated with freedom, land, work, and possible migration affected a family, not merely a historical character. Unfortunately, the surviving record gives us far less of their voices than we would want. The missing testimony is not evidence of mystery in the sensational sense. It is evidence of whose words 19th century institutions considered worth preserving. The longest cave and the shortest record. Today, Mammoth Cave is measured in hundreds of miles, and exploration continues. The system's scale can make Bishop's mapped world look small. That is the wrong comparison. Every map is a statement of knowledge at a particular moment. Bishop's document captured the cave before electric lighting, before modern surveying, before the National Park Service, before organized cave research teams, and before the 1972 connection established Mammoth Cave's global status. It also captured a social reality. The map placed the name of an enslaved black guide on a scientific-looking object, sold to a largely white traveling public. In doing so, it preserved a contradiction that later generations cannot honestly simplify. Bishop was celebrated, but not free. Trusted underground, but legally controlled above it. Treated as an authority by visitors who returned to a society that denied him equal citizenship. Credited on paper, but incompletely represented in the archive. This pattern extends beyond Mammoth Cave. Much of American infrastructure, agriculture, domestic life, craft, knowledge, and environmental expertise was built by people whose names were omitted from official accounts. Bishop's case is unusual because the name survived so visibly. The map therefore asks us to reconsider what a historical document is. It is not only a picture of passages. It is a record of labor. It shows where human beings had traveled, but it also shows whose memory the enterprise could not function without. The safest conclusion is not that Bishop was a mysterious savant who performed an impossible feat. It is that he was a highly intelligent, intensely practiced explorer and guide whose occupation trained a rare spatial memory. He learned from repeated experience, from other guides, from visitors, and from the cave itself. He then produced a map, impressive enough to remain useful and influential long after its publication. That explanation is ordinary only in the sense that human skill has causes. It does not make the result ordinary. The real wonder is that a man denied formal opportunity developed expertise that formal institutions had to recognize. What his map still asks us to see. Return to the map's lower edge. The title is large. Mammoth Cave dominates the page. Bishop's name is smaller, but it is there. For decades, many viewers treated the cave as the main subject and the cartographer as a footnote. A more complete reading reverses the emphasis. The lines matter because of the mind that held them together. What is confirmed? Stephen Bishop arrived at Mammoth Cave as an enslaved teenager in 1838. He became one of its most important guides and explorers. He helped expand the known cave beyond established tourist routes. In 1842, according to the National Park Service's historical account, he drew a map of explored passages from memory. At Locust Grove. The map was published and credited to him. He gained freedom in 1856 and died in 1857. What is qualified? His map should be called one of the first detailed maps, not confidently the first map of any kind. Its relationships are more reliable than its exact scale. Some dramatic stories about his explorations were embellished in later retellings. The claim that one line anticipated the 1972 cave connection is a later interpretation, not a prediction Bishop himself recorded. What remains unknown? Large parts of his early life. His own full account of learning, exploration, marriage, fatherhood, and freedom. The exact circumstances of many discoveries. The private thoughts of a man whose public intelligence was described repeatedly by others. The absence of those answers should not be filled with invented dialogue or heroic fantasy. Respect for Bishop requires restraint. His documented achievement is already powerful. He entered Mammoth Cave in a society that treated him as property. Inside, he learned a landscape that confounded educated visitors. He carried its branching structure in memory, gave names to darkness, and drew a document that outlived the people who claimed ownership over him. Perhaps that is why the map remains so affecting. It records more than explored ground. It records the difference between legal status and human capacity. Mammoth Cave was never the work of one explorer, and its history did not begin in the 19th century. But among the many people who shaped our knowledge of it, Stephen Bishop stands out because his map survives as direct evidence of expertise that slavery could exploit but could not erase. The final question is not whether Bishop deserves to be remembered as a genius. The map has already answered that. The harder question is this: how many other maps of American history are still being read with the most important name treated as a footnote?